Oh, how do I start this? I guess I'll lay out the situation. Joined the Army when I was 17, right out of high school. Spent 20 years in, deployed about a half a dozen times, some of which I'd never talk about. This is not counting travels around the world, performing missions that I'm definitely not getting into. Now, I will say that I was never Special Forces, but I've seemed to be in the right or maybe wrong place at the right or wrong time a lot. Not to say I didn't try out for them, I did, but you can't force them to select you. Now, before I go too far off subject, I will get into what you're all interested in. As I was in the process of retiring from my service, I was looking into what type of work I could get my hands on. For many men leaving, they just get a bunch of emails from certain groups that wish to cash in on your certifications and security clearance. Unfortunately for me, since I was infantry, the entire time, the main portion was most of what I received as mercenary units. I don't know if you've ever worked with them, but I have. To make a long story very short, I just deleted the emails. I don't have time for people like them. The few job offers that were worth looking into, that is, until you find out they're just glorified security guards. Most barely pay any better than the Army itself. After a few phone interviews, I found one that was only interested in retirees for some reason. The pay was really good, and they sent me a contract stating that I would be doing some type of reconnaissance work. Guaranteed travel, but must have experience with potential hostile situations and multiple survival skills. I figured, why the hell not? Check them out, might as well, since I would be traveling that way for my terminal leave. The leave that you take while your time runs out of service. After so many lackluster job opportunities, I was surprised to find this place in a blue collar portion of a major city. Though the building didn't look like much from the outside, it was the inside that was a very different story. The inside was very sterile, with bleach white floors and walls that looked brand spanking new. Artwork prints were all over the walls to offset the blandness of the solid white room. The reception area had two receptionists, yet there were no other personnel besides the three of us in sight. Let's just say this put me on a little bit of an edge. Things just seemed a bit off to me, but I approached the receptionists and they both snapped into action. One welcomed me as the other one opened a drawer and began to pull out a large file and a bunch of items for me. The first one began to brief me as though I was about to go on to a mission, as the other one began to put the items in front of me as the first one referenced each and every one of them. The items included a security badge, a company pen that doubled as a recovery beacon if the security badge stopped working, a thick file with many of my records in it, actually surprised they even had hard copies in this day and age, a non disclosure agreement that I had to sign before we continued. Don't worry, I was going to read it first, and a map of the facility. After her briefing that seemed so mechanical you could have confused her with a robot, she told me to use the pass to go through the doors to my left. When I told her that I only came for an interview, she simply kept telling me to go through the doors. Now I was truly on edge. You see, I'm a divorcee with grown children, so it wouldn't be hard for somebody to disappear me. I know that sounds paranoid, but don't forget what I used to do for a living. I insisted that someone come out to meet me. When she refused, I left everything on the counter and walked towards the front doors. Though when I pulled on the door, it was already locked. I turned to the reception desk, returned and grabbed the security badge and tried to unlock the door. Since the door wouldn't open, I turned and demanded that the door be unlocked. The robotic one just looked at me while the other was speaking into a phone. I suspected that I was about to be taken as I pulled out my FN-45 from behind my back and pointed it right at the robotic woman's head and said, "Open it." This was the first time she showed emotion, although the emotion of I hope I don't shit my pants. As I began to put just a little bit of pressure on the trigger, I heard the side door to my left open and a voice loudly proclaim, "There's no need for that." Note that I do not keep the safety on. It wastes time. I could see through my peripheral view that a man in a suit without a jacket was walking in. I kept my eyes on the receptionist since I could clearly see them both. The man actually stepped in front of me to protect the women and introduced himself. For the purpose of this entry, I will simply call him El Doctor, only because I found out later that his mother was Hispanic and he spoke every dialect of Spanish known. Nice guy, though. Once he introduced himself, and I recognized his name and voice from the phone, I placed my pistol back in the holster. He then led me way into the back. The doctor said, "I hope you didn't hold it against us too much for the confusion up front. I thought it was surprised that you brought a gun." "Pistol," I said. "It's not a full automatic." He looked at me confused. Looking back at him, I said, "Gun refers to things like machine gun or submachine gun, weapons that will keep firing until you release the trigger, run out of ammo, or stop feeding it." With this, as we walked, he smiled. I guess he realized as I showed him that I wasn't just some brainless ogre that only knew how to squeeze a trigger. El Doctor continued with, "Still, it's illegal to have one of those within the city limits." I stopped and turned to him. "The way you address my questions over the phone tells me that whatever you're doing here isn't exactly legal. So can we dispense with the bullshit and we can get down to why I'm here?" El Doctor there smiled again, but this time larger. "Well, I could explain, but it would be better if I showed you." And with that, we turned down several hallways, stopping only briefly to unlock a few doors. I even checked my security pass on the doors on the way through. This time they worked. A bit relieved, to say the least. Finally, as we entered a large viewing room, set up like a high-level officers had been getting a brief there. "Now, I do not expect for you to understand everything at first, so I will explain it as best I can." He sat down next to me and used the touchscreen to darken the room a little and turn on the projector. After a few seconds, I could see him going through the files. "Back in the late 1940s, our top scientists began to experiment with teleportation as a way to save lives crossing the Atlantic from Nazi U-boats." I injected, Doc, please do not blow smoke up my ass. It was to save them money from all the tons of cargo that was being sunk. Do we have an agreement not to lie to each other now?" Kind of wanted to kick myself for taking a line off a horrible movie. But I did have to give him a look that says, "Do that again, and I'm out of here." The doctor, seemingly understanding the situation, continued. "Regardless of the reasons, the first experiments with small items went fine. But when we tried to jump the USS Eldridge, there were complications." A bunch of images began to pass on the screen, images of sailors fused into the hull of the ship, a few still alive, with their arms and their legs fused into the hull. Unfortunately, there were no survivors. I shot him another look because I knew exactly what that meant. Since then, we've been experimenting and found out that we were not just working with teleportation, but time dilation too. He turned my way with an expect a reaction, but I was just studying the data in front of me. Shaking that off, he continued, "Over the past 70 years, we have made great strides, and it has become extremely safe. As you can see, we have sent several others through to see what the future holds for us." "Just the future?" I asked him. "The past is too high of a risk, as there would be a butterfly effect. Plus, we have had more than just one try to alter the past. The results tend to be wildly variable, from no change to one causing his own loss of limb. No paradoxes, but like I said, it's too high risk." Adjusting the files, he again focused on the screen. As you can see from the videos, you can see some of our personnel going through and coming back. The scene in front of me played out like a strange dance. I kept one eye on the timestamps for the videos, as the first ones were in black and white, but slowly becoming better quality. The first few that went through were rather violent. So violent, in fact, that one man broke his arm as he came flying back through and slammed on the concrete floor. With each improvement of the machines over time, the time shifts became less and less violent until it looks like one of those bad sci fi shows where you just walk through the gate. At first, the men only showed up in a couple of jumps, and then they were replaced. As they went on, a few men could be seen getting older as they time jumped from one video to the other. In one case, the man looked younger when he came back. Not just a few years either, but by about a decade. I didn't say anything about the time, but it definitely caught my attention. Now, I'm sure you're asking what the time machine looked like. Well, that all depends. You see, when it started, the machine looked like something out of the original show Lost in Space. As they progressed, I noticed that they were beginning to look and act like all those science fiction time machines. When I noticed the timestamps, almost all of the time machines they used in movies and television shows were based off these actual designs. Even the old Terminator time dilation orb that required a time traveler to jump naked, no shit, which was the only time I see them ever use a female. I wanted to shoot a look at the doc, but I was far too captivated by what I saw on the screen, and not for the reason you think. When it was all over, he just looked at me and asked, "Well?" I responded with, "I'm not getting into the ball naked." He, of course, chuckled. "So you're in?" I looked at him and said, "Well, that depends." "On what?" "How much does this pay? And do I get benefits?" Now, I'm not going to tell you how much I made, but let's just say I had fuck you money in just over 2 years. And yes, I did get very good benefits package with that. My next few days were spent familiarizing myself with the machine and the facility. I even got a trainer. He had been doing this for a few years and had been on about 50 jumps. Yes, that's what they call it. I used to be airborne, so it just kind of sort of fit. In any case, he informed me that the process didn't actually hurt. It did tingle a little bit, but you get used to it, he said. Turns out they were hiring a bunch of new jumpers. Turns out there was a very high turnover rate, mainly due to what we were going to see and experience could easily be overwhelming for many of them. Most of us were prior service, but about 25% were scientists. Now, you would think that combat soldiers could be the ones with the bad attitudes. Nope. I was not the first to jump, so I had a chance to watch the entire process. It was pretty simple, all things considered. You stand in the center of the time machine, and a wave of energy builds up and on the top and the bottom of the machine, and a wave of energy, which just clearly just looks like light, goes across you, and the next thing you know, you are wherever, whenever. You go with several recording devices, but you're told to narrate when you get there. You have a set time before you return. However, you can return early with an emergency retrieval device. That is, in case you're wondering why there's a schedule, well, it's simple. You see, the machine needs to charge for a few seconds in order to jump. Once it pulls you back, all your inertia continues to push you through. In one instance, one guy drove a vehicle back through on accident. He ended up slamming the vehicle into the wall about 80 miles an hour. There is a space around the time machine, but not enough to stop a runaway car. There is also one more issue. If you are in the machine when somebody tries to return, you can both end up atomized. Since the machine requires almost constant checks, it is very dangerous for the maintenance crew as well, especially in this instance. While waiting for my turn to jump, I spent most of my downtime reading old mission reports and watching videos. At least, the ones they allowed me to watch. I was watching one of my buddies jump when one of the crew members walked up and put a file in my chest. Now, this may sound like the most impersonal way of briefing somebody for a mission, but it's for good reason. Let's just say there's a reason they don't want to get too close to us. You see, either most jump a few times and just say, nope, or they just have to risk getting damaged on one of their missions and damaged permanently. My mission was actually very simple. I was to jump 7 years into the future and record the news, all the reports, and link up with a few informants. Now, you may think that this would be a cakewalk. Well, for the most part, you'd be right. Now, for what you're all waiting for. Getting ready for my first jump, it was the summer of 2018. I put on the mandatory monitoring devices used to monitor my heart, blood pressure, and things like that. Was outfitted with recording devices. By the way, this tech was far beyond what we had now for commercial use. Now, I will say, I probably looked calm, but my nerves were going crazy. It must have registered on their systems because one of the veterans came over and gave me a bullshit safety briefing. You would be surprised how something so simple can calm your nerves. I walked into the machine and one of the crew reminded me that this was a recon mission and not to try and look up anything beyond the mission. Now I knew this was just for show since everyone did just a little bit of snooping regardless. Now, I mean, not that you could help it anyway. Mainly, claiming that their batteries went dead without them noticing, and they had to replace them, or some such line of bullshit to make sure they weren't spotted while they did their own little snooping. Standing in the machine, the guy going through the final checks asked, "Are you ready?" "Does it matter?" I asked back at him. He kind of shrugged and flipped the last few switches. I tried to lighten the mood and take my mind off everything by asking, "So, how many people have said they really have to suddenly take a piss when you ask them that question anyway?" He just gave me a look that said, "I'll tell you when you get back." And with that, he hit the switch and the light pulsated. As instructed, I bent my knees slightly due to the fact that sometimes the displacement will leave you a few feet in the air. More than one guy broke his leg due to the landing going straight leg down. Just figure about falling from a single story building and then having your legs straight out. Crunch and ouch. In a moment, it was over, and I found myself in a field. I only dropped maybe half an inch or so, and there was no pain. But it sure did tingle. It tingled in ways that made me realize why there were not many female jumpers. Woo, I had to shake it off. After gaining my bearings, I looked around and walked to the closest road I could find. If you were wondering why I didn't fuse with the foliage, that's due to the dilation bubble. It won't destroy or melt things like the movies, but it will push things out of the way. Well, enough of the technical stuff. As you can imagine, 7 years won't change too much. Houses and vehicles look pretty much the same. Still, the same type of solar panels on people's roofs. Even the clothing style was the same. Then again, it was difficult to surpass a t shirt and jeans. I got to the road and quickly got my bearings, as it wasn't long until I found my first contact. Actually, it was his farm that I entered. Nice guy and all. We sat in the next room talking while I set up my cameras to watch the multiple TVs he had set up. He told me that jumpers had been coming to his place regularly for the past few years, being that our present was so close, timeline speaking. There was also no chance of some sort of Mandela effect happening to him, so he wasn't worried. He was also paid by the same people to simply have the televisions ready so that they would get all the information. Along with this, I had to hook up everything to the internet, but they had to be careful about that because hackers are just infamous for the deep and dark web. Yes, those are two different things. Thankfully, they paid him very good. And yes, it does pay to keep your mouth shut on a few things. If you're wondering why we didn't just download things from the net, well, in case you weren't listening the first time, it's not the smartest of ideas, and you will most likely catch a bug, some sort of computer virus that is more advanced than anything we could handle even just a few years back. 7 years is a long time in the tech field. I mean, come on, let's face it. Every about 3 years, your computer is completely outdated, and that timeline is getting shorter. As we spoke, he informed me that he didn't want to risk losing his existence over being erased by another time traveler. Just like in the movies, if you take out someone's parents, then they don't get born. Well, sort of. You see, the timeline has a way of adjusting itself. I understood this due to one of the files. In one couple was chosen at random, and the night they were due to conceive a child, a jumper was sent to ruin the mood. They did this by faking an accident in front of the couple and wasting their entire night taking him to the hospital. This was back in the 1920s, and the couple were my contact's great great grandparents. Instead of getting pregnant that night, which was their best chance of the month, she got pregnant the next month and delivered a month early. Now, there I was, talking with this man that has no idea that time is adjusted just to make sure he's still here. Now, they tried similar experiments with someone who was supposed to die in a vehicle crash. All they did was make sure the vehicle was unable to start after she exited the bar. Oddly enough, but it worked. And then she slipped in the tub the next morning. And what's even odd, or more odd, I should say, is she didn't die, but was hospitalized for a couple of weeks. This being said, this is not always the case. Time is fickle that way. In fact, many of the crew members were saved in similar manners. Something I would find out later, of course. The fact that they were still kicking years later showed that there were no absolutes. We sat there talking until my watch went off. This was a warning to tell me to collect my equipment and get ready to go back. So I gathered everything and got ready to jump back. That is, after thanking him, my host, for his hospitality. I walked through the field until my watch beeped a second time. With that, I hit the retrieval device and then suddenly tripped on the platform as I exited the field. Four men in suits walked quickly up to me. I thought they were going to help me up, but instead, two of them ripped the cameras out of my hands and the other two dragged me into the next room. Thought for sure I was going to be freaking ended right there and then. Instead, they dropped me into a chair and began pulling the monitoring equipment off of me. I was confused and disoriented. You see, when you come back through, there's a massive jolt to your system. And the faster you go, the worse it gets. That's why they tell you to hold still. I didn't know it at the time, but the monitoring equipment had a lot more in it than just a heart monitor. A guy I never saw before began asking me a bunch of questions. I was groggy as hell, and it took me a minute to come back into reality enough. At that point, I found out that I was over 3 days behind schedule. My exact words when finding this out were, "What the fuck?" As it turns out, there was an issue with the recovery system, and after a couple hours of being grilled about what had happened to the same men from before, walking in saying that they had reviewed everything, and I was telling them the truth, that I didn't even know there was a time difference. Though they didn't figure out the problem for almost a week, which meant it was a week without jumping until they addressed the issue that it was. Well, that's how everything started. Sorry for jumping around much, but as you can see, the number of variables is to be, well, considered and is very considerate. Now, if you wish to hear more, then let me know and I will continue. Now, I realize this wasn't quite the scary story, but trust me, things can get very creepy.